If you would turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 3. We're in a sermon series called Grace Strategies. We've been rolling through 1 Peter, and it's been really good for me. I don't know about for you guys, but I've really enjoyed it. Difficult, to say the least, to process through some of these scriptures and apply them to my life, but I'm excited to go to 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 12, which in the Worship Center Bible is page 1202. From time to time, they let me on stage, and then I get in trouble, and I can't come back for a while, and then I'm back. So the reason I'm here this morning is Pastor Jeff is he's taking what's called a study focus, and spending the next 4 weeks planning really hard for the fall and the year. For our sermon series and where we go as a church. And so as you're thinking about it, you can be praying for Jeff, because that's a tough job, and just praying that he hears from the Lord. And I'm excited for the coming year, and I think it's really cool that Jeff takes that time to prepare. I wonder how many of us this last week, I don't know if it was just me, but how many of us said something like this statement, this is the good life. If you're like me, for the 4th of July, or even just during the summer, we have so few days of warm weather, it feels like here. And so Julianne and I and the kids, we have this little pop-up camper, and we take off and we go camping as much as we can. And so this last weekend, we went up to Big Fork, where Julianne's parents live, and popped our camper up on their property, because the breakfast is always so much better when we go inside their house than on the campgrounds. And there were aunts and uncles everywhere, and we swam in the lake, and we did fireworks, and it was relaxing because aunts and uncles were watching our kids. And so there were a few times this week where I thought, oh man, this is a good life. I actually grew up in a state where the slogan is the good life. It's Nebraska. How much better could it get than Nebraska, right? That is the good life. So the scriptures this morning really kind of point in this direction of what is a good life and how do we live a good life. And I feel like I am uniquely gifted to preach this message because of where I grew up. So if you've ever been to Nebraska, you know that truly is the good life. Just kidding. If you came and stood on this stage and just kind of looked across it, that's what Nebraska is, just really flat. It's beautiful. But when life is good, like this weekend, when things are in order, when we feel relaxed and comfortable and happy, it seems to me that, at least for me, I operate kind of in a kinder, gentler manner than normal Robbie, natural Robbie would operate. And then when I wake up this morning in a bunk bed somehow, tired because kids are waking up all night and I'm trying to get them back to sleep and stuff like that, I feel myself starting to not be this nice person. And so it's interesting to me that in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, Peter, and forward up to this point, Peter has really been giving special words of guidance and teaching and encouragement to submit. And what is unbelievable to me is that even in the midst of this persecution, where believers were being crucified upside down, Peter's encouraging his readers to love life, and even when life isn't good, to love life. He's addressed Christian citizens of Rome and told them how to relate to authority. And if you guys remember, the authority was probably Nero. So they're likely being persecuted, and he's spoken to servants, and he's told them how to relate to their masters. And if you remember, there were a lot of slaves in that day. I can't remember the exact number, but I think Rome had something like 60 million slaves or something crazy like that. He's spoken to Christian wives of unbelieving husbands and showed them a way to win their husbands to Christ, and he's spoken to husbands about living wisely and considerately with their wives. And so he is speaking to a people who are suffering, where life is tense, and calling them to react in submission and calling them to react in kindness. And Peter he's not telling them this because he wants them to hate their lives. like, oh, just live this terrible life. He knows that the joy of glorifying God and proclaiming his excellencies, that this is where his readers will find their joy. This is where his readers will find a good life. And so today, Peter speaks to us as members of the church first in verse 8, and then as members of society, and he really decides to make this group as broad as he can, and he's going to say some words that may be hard for us at first to apply. But here we go. Here are the words. Verse 8, finally, all of you live in harmony. Be sympathetic, love as brothers, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you are called so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So he starts out in these verses with these words, finally, all of you. All of you here means all of you Christians as you live together. These verses, this first verse, verse 8, is not about how we relate to civil authority anymore. It's not about masters. It's not about unbelieving husbands or wives. Verse 8 is specifically about how to relate to each other in our lives as Christians. I'm not sure if this happened in very many schools. I wonder sometimes if the teachers saw me coming and decided to make this a thing. But maybe this happened. Do you remember in school when some of your teachers would start the first day and say, let's make a list of rules that we're all going to follow in the classroom, and everyone got to participate, and kids would raise their hand and say, no talking when somebody else is talking, or is this a thing, or was it just a thing for me? Okay. I'm going to pretend it's a thing. Be respectful, no calling names, stuff like that. And you make this list for your classroom, and Peter starts here in these verses with what looks like a very similar type of list. Do this and this and this, and it's like, here will be our values as a church, and this is what we want you guys to follow. But really what he's saying is be a certain kind of people. There are hundreds of things that Peter could say about the relationships in the life of Christians as they live together. Hundreds. And he doesn't just make this list of things to do. He calls us and his people to be a kind of people. And it's not a kind of people that you can be on your own. It's really so against the grain of human nature, just as submitting to authorities we don't agree with is, just as living with a spouse that we disagree with is, and it's virtually impossible without the work of God's mercy. So this list is who we are as believers, not some to-do list that will help us get there. So because of God's mercy, here's the list. We are called to live in harmony. Peter says, all of you live in harmony, which another translation would say to be like-minded. So for me, when I hear like-minded, I would say that is when you think like I do. Now you have a like mind. You agree with me and we are like-minded, but that is not what Peter has in mind here. He's not calling us to agree on everything. Being harmonious or like-minded does not mean becoming a clone. That's what we would call a cult. Harmony is the operative principle in Christianity. A good illustration is an orchestra made up of many different musicians with a wide variety of instruments, but many different parts to be played, even by the same kind of instrument. In a good orchestra, every member plays the same song, and all follow the leadership of one conductor. So that's how it's supposed to be in the church. We may not all agree on what carpet color to have, or if the wall should have ever been painted black, or music volume, or any of these things that we like to talk about, or song choices, or even what translation we use of the Bible, but we have all embraced the same gospel, trusting in the same Savior and following his leadership through his word and his Spirit. And it's this is more, I think, relevant to me than it ever has been, but far too many of us break up, in quotes, and do not proclaim the excellencies of God to a hostile world because we disagree on what certainly is a secondary issue. So we can disagree on many things and still live like-minded with one another if we keep our focus on the Lord Jesus Christ. And so Peter is calling these people who are under severe intensity to be harmonious, to live like-minded, because that proclaims God's excellencies. And then Peter says, all of you be sympathetic. It's interesting that the term sympathetic is a compound word made up from the root word suffer and the prefix with. And so it originally meant to suffer with. To be sympathetic is to suffer with. Romans 12:15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. And what it means to be sympathetic could be illustrated by the way that people drive in other countries, at least from my experience. We were in El Salvador a couple months ago, a month ago, I don't even know. The road could have 3 lanes going each direction or 2 lanes going each direction, but there could possibly be 5 cars or 6 cars across at one time. While traffic signs and lights are mostly obeyed, one thing is really noticeable to me. And it's really as I'm trying not to scream and cry. And in the apparent chaos, every driver is aware of what the other drivers are doing. When one car veers to miss a motorcycle who certainly has a death wish, the other cars adjust accordingly. It's just this real flow to each other's movement. This is truly the way of sympathy in the church, and what Peter is saying is we are so in touch with what is happening in each other's lives that we move in and we move when our members move. St. Augustine put it this way: if there be a thorn in the foot, the back bends. The eyes search, the hands are ready, and all parts are quick and active to relieve the member that is grieved. And this is the just resemblance of that charity that arises from unity. The whole body feels the smart and needs of a suffering member. And so Peter is telling these people, we're aware of each other's what's happening, and we're sympathetic. And then Peter says, all of you love as brothers. And the word brother is translated Philadelphia, which is brotherly love. And this is a word that most of us can relate to. Most of us have a sibling, and sibling love is something that maybe we understand, knowing that most people maybe wouldn't call that love. But I have 2 sisters, and I don't remember always getting along with my sisters. There were times for sure that we got into it. There weren't a lot of power struggles for me between, like, can I have your Barbie or stuff like that. But we did have battles. And I remember many times, I have a sister, she's almost exactly a year younger than me. A grade younger than me, a little bit younger than me, but so she was right behind me in school all the way up, and she was such a brat, and she would get in so much trouble with people, and I remember so many times on the playground having her back, even against my friends, because though I wasn't the kindest to her, no one else got to mess with my sister. That's just a rule, okay? And sometimes there are fights with brothers and sisters, and sometimes you fight for them. We don't view fellow believers, and this is something I really need to work on. We don't view fellow believers as strangers or as mere acquaintances or as distant relatives. We are to view other believers as close family. And family can have some pretty serious disagreements and exchange some very harsh words, but only in the rarest cases does the family break up over it. And so Peter is saying this is how we love each other. And then he says we're compassionate. I really, at this point, I want to be like, Peter, give it a break, man. We get it. But here he goes. The Greek word for compassionate is actually a compound made up of 2 other words, good plus bowels. You're going to need to hang on with me for a second. This is going somewhere, but just don't write me off. The Greek lexicon I used said that the translation was strong bowels. The Greek believed that the deepest emotions, love, joy, hate, anger, mercy, didn't come from the heart or the mind, but from the intestines and the bowels. We mean something similar when we talk about deep belly laughter. My greatest joy as a father comes when my kids get that deep, like you can tell it's hurting their stomach kind of laugh. There's this kind of laugh that they do that comes from the chest, and I know that it means already that they're just laughing at me with courtesy. The belly laugh, though, is entirely different because it comes from much lower, and it is so real. And Peter calls Christians to have these deep emotions for those in need. It takes it takes courage to have intestinal fortitude to care enough to get involved in the needs of others. And in thinking about this, it occurred to me that while I'm looking at these decorations for China, and Luke and Amy are coming next week, that we have brothers and sisters in Christ that are not free to worship in their countries, and we see so many headlines of persecution or hurt, and we become numb. And we do this surface compassion where we sort of, oh, that's too bad, but Peter calls believers to deep compassion that moves us. This is a matter of prayer for us. Prayer for God to give us eyes to see and hearts to care. And then the last trait in Peter's list of the kind of people that we are is humble. He says to be humble. Well, this again isn't a way that we act or a part of our to-do list, but this is who we are on the inside. With all authenticity, we have a lowly spirit. We feel that we are utterly dependent on God for life and breath and intelligence and emotional stability and faith and safety and the use of our senses. And we feel so fragile and vulnerable to ourselves. And on top of that, we feel sinful and unworthy. And as we look at ourselves apart from God's grace, we feel like nothing. And God's grace makes us awestruck that we are so loved, and it doesn't make us pushy, and doesn't make us self-assertive. And these 5 words that Peter pieces together here are a description of what Peter says Christians are. All of you be this way, you are this way. And these words are, again, not just what Christians should do. This is who, by God's mercy, we are made to be. We have a common mindset, we are sympathetic, we have family love, we are deeply compassionate, and we are humble. And that is a very unusual human being, isn't it? That is a very unusual church. And yet that is what Peter tells the church in his letter. And we're going to come back to that towards the end here. But then Peter shifts and he broadens his statements and his encouragement. And he says, love your enemies. In verse 9, he says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. So you could say that verse 8 is the attitude of a believer. This is who we are. And then verse 9 is this response. As you practice this attitude, your response should be verse 9. And as Christians, we can live on one of 3 levels. Return evil for good, which is really a demonic, satanic level, doing evil for good. We can return good for good or evil for evil, which is a very natural human level. You give me a donut, and now I will do good to you. That's good for good, or evil for evil, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Or we can return good for evil, which is really a supernatural response, and that's what Peter is calling for. And this verse is actually tied in with this referencing 1 Peter 2, verse 21. For to this you were called because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example so that you should follow in his steps. So you were called to do good because Christ did good for you. As God's children, there is more to us than just an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth mentality, which is the basis of justice. We operate on the basis of mercy, because that is the way that God deals with us. Mercy includes forgiveness. So this must have meant a lot, a great deal to a person like Peter, because he himself once drew a sword to fight for Christ in the garden. Do you remember that? Cutting off an ear of a soldier. And now he's shifted. He's calling his readers to not repay evil with evil. Why? We'll get to this in a second, but in these verses it says, because you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. So Peter anchors their relationship to outsiders in their calling and to their promising them a blessing. So what is this blessing? What is this blessing that Peter's talking about? Well, it's a good life. We will all move to Nebraska. Just kidding. So his readers are probably saying, oh, nice, then no more persecution. Or you and I might be saying, oh, great, now I can have that motorcycle I want. Or if I do all of this, I will receive a blessing. Life will be good. And Peter in these verses in chapter 3 and through these scriptures is linking this blessing with the suffering of these people. And the people were experiencing great trial on earth. And that only adds to the blessing of glory in heaven someday for sure. I mean, we know this. Matthew 5:10-12 says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you falsely and say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So that is awesome. We realize we receive a blessing in the kingdom of heaven for sure, and it does give us hope to carry on. We have future hope, but we also inherit a blessing today when we submit for the Lord's sake and are loving and compassionate. What may appear as bad days to the world can be good days for a Christian if we only meet these certain criteria. Well, how can I say this? Because of the next verses in this section, verses 10-12. "For whoever would love life," or in other translations, if you want to enjoy life. So here we're reading all these verses, and now we get to this point in verse 10 where Peter is saying, if you want to enjoy life. So Peter looks back at the psalmist in Psalm 34:12-16 to support what he's about to teach. He quotes David in verses 10-12, and he is saying that this spirit-directed and empowered way of denying yourself for others is what really provides a life of blessing. It's what really provides a good life. The outcome of all of this is protected and guaranteed by God. So Peter now pulls words from David from the Old Testament, and he's going to give practical principles for living peacefully in a hostile, to the Christian people, a hostile culture. So here's what verses 10-12 say, and these are David's words from Psalm 34. "Whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and the ears are attentive to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." So Peter continues his thought process by quoting a man who really experienced brutal days. You see, Saul was out to kill David, and David found himself seeking refuge in the Philistine city of Gath. When he realized that he was recognized as the one who had slain Goliath, David knew that he was again in danger because word was about to spread. And in order to make it out of Gath alive, he clawed at the gates of the city, ranting and raving like a lunatic. Because the king thought he was insane, he allowed David to go his way. Psalm 34, the section quoted by Peter, was written by David when he was running for his life. David isn't sitting in a palace lazy boy with a freshly brewed cup of coffee, writing in his sheepskin journal or whatever he had, this beautiful psalm. David is running for his life in the cave of Adullam, and he says this, "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips, for I have tasted and seen, even in the midst of these difficult times, that the Lord is good." Who will love life and see good days? Society would tell us that it's the one who can make his life problems-free or insulate himself from difficulty, who escapes adversity. And David says just the opposite as he is running. And Peter quotes him to people who are suffering, and they say, he says, if you are wondering how the next bill will be paid, or if your marriage will work, or if you can submit to this tyrannical boss, or if you can keep on doing good to people who are horrible to you, the Lord makes himself most real to you in those moments. He says it's when you're trapped in Gath, as David was, that suddenly you see God working. If we really embrace what Peter is saying, what David is declaring, and what James 1:2 says, that consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, then we probably would not focus on trying to make our lives easier. Instead, we would say, in all things, I will taste and I will see that the Lord is good. And we all probably know people who have insulated themselves from problems, and they don't have challenges, and who have succeeded in making their lives as easy as possible. And yet, the easier it gets for them, the less joy there is within them. And Peter says something here that is absolutely shocking to our culture. Again, he's been saying shocking things for the last 4 weeks, I know, but this is so shocking, at least to our culture. And he says this: in the midst of suffering, difficulty, and challenges, your goal is not to fix your problem. Peter doesn't spend chapter after chapter providing self-help material to these people who are suffering. He says this: choose to do good and seek peace. Choose to submit and honor, because you will find that you love life, because God will meet you in the midst of your difficulty. You will find that you love life when the God that you serve is being fully glorified in your life. This is the good life. The good life is that the promise that we have as elect exiles is that the eyes of the Lord is towards us. The end of verse 12. He draws near to us. Even if evil is being done to us, he still draws near to us. So here's the big question, and I kind of feel like I've sort of been rambling. How do we apply this? How do we apply this? I don't want this to come across as like some moralistic message. If you're moral, then you'll be close to God. Because that's not the gospel. Do better and then God will meet you. That's not the gospel. If you're like me, and actually I'm just going to apply this to me and allow you to apply it to yourselves. I am a terrible submitter. I mean, awful. I hate authority. I love Pastor Jeff. I hate authority. No, seriously, like, you tell me not to do something, and I'm going to do it just to see how you react. Like, I am the perfect middle schooler, and that's why I did that so well for years, I think. But authority, and then you start saying, Robbie, be sympathetic. No. Buck up. Be compassionate. It's just not, I just can't do it. It's not in my genetics. My dad's a farm kid from Nebraska. He doesn't talk very much, and our dog was really good because he beat her. You know, like, this is not how I operate. I'm not tender. And then you read these verses and say, how do we apply this? You're encouraging me to be something that I'm not. I cannot submit. I love justice. I hate when injustice is happening, and so I want to fight people when they're being rude. And I want to engage with people when I feel like I disagree with them. And here is the big application piece for us this morning, at least for me. Here's where I have to fall. Even as I review my notes this morning, I kept coming back to this one spot. And it's this: go on trusting God. I'm not going to just tell you that and not have a verse or something to make it work. But all 5 of these descriptive words in verse 8 are descriptions of what we are as believers on the inside, not primarily how we act. If you are born again, if the Spirit of God dwells in you, if Christ is your treasure and God is your hope, then the seed of all of these traits is in you. The seed of all of these traits are in us if you're followers of Christ. And they will flourish if you go on trusting God for those things. The key for the people that Peter was writing to, and the key for you and I, is found in the back in chapter 1 of 1 Peter. 1 Peter 1 verse 3 says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." So all of this is so against the grain of human nature that is virtually impossible without the work of God's mercy called new birth in these verses. And what is our new birth into? It's into living hope. In other words, we go on trusting God for his future. Endless, rock-like dependability to meet all of our needs, physical, moral, spiritual, and the Spirit will be released in us to work these utterly unnatural and wonderful traits. Our goal is to be what only God can make us, and as we rely on him, we glorify him. And as we glorify him, we have this good life, even when by all outside estimations it looks bad. And so this morning, by way of really immediate application, I want to give us time to pray. And the worship team can come up. I want to give us time to pray. If you are a believer in Jesus, you have been born into living hope. You have access to what is a good life and honoring God, and the seed of all of these things are within us. And so this morning, before we do communion, I'm going to give us some time to pray and to ask God to grow these things in us. You know, in this list, what you struggle with. And I just want us to take just this real raw time to just say, God, first of all, I need you to reaffirm in my life that you are the living hope and that you are in control of my physical and emotional and spiritual needs. And Lord, I'm really struggling with being sympathetic. I'm really struggling with being compassionate. I'm really struggling with humility. And Father, I need you to grow that in me because this is so unnatural for me. So I just want us to take some time just being real with God and just in the quietness of your heart praying and asking the Lord to grow those things within us.